The Sierra Nevada, a granite cathedral of stone and shadow, holds secrets deeper than its canyons. And in the heart of that immense wilderness, in the seemingly benign expanse of Yosemite National Park, a certain horror played out, a sequence of events so brutal and unthinkable that for years, it defied all attempts at explanation. The story begins, not with a scream, but with an absence. It begins, as all great mysteries must, with a moment of perfectly ordinary farewell. Imagine the scene. It is the winter of 1999, specifically a chilly February, when the world outside the valley floor of Yosemite is a place of frosted, crystalline beauty. Into this quiet magnificence came a family, a mother, Carol Sund, her teenage daughter, Julie, and a young Argentine exchange student, Sund-Pelosso. They were simply tourists, seeking a moment of peace and the spectacular vista of the winter waterfalls. The Cedar Lodge, a rustic but comfortable resort nestled in El Portal just outside the park entrance, became their final stop. They checked in on February 12th, their itinerary promising a joyful few days of sightseeing before they would drive home to Eureka, California. But the mountains swallowed them whole. The final point of contact was the evening of February 15th, a casual, loving phone call that provided no hint of the nightmare to come. Then, the phone call stopped. The itinerary dissolved into nothingness. When the women failed to check out and failed to return home, a quiet, dreadful panic began to bloom in the hearts of their loved ones. A missing persons case was immediately initiated. But how does one search for 3 people in a national park that encompasses over 1,200 square miles of rugged, unforgiving terrain? The initial focus was predictable. They must have gotten lost, succumbed to the treacherous winter weather, perhaps driven off a remote, icy road. It was a search built on hope, a desperate effort to find the lost, not the murdered. But the disappearance defied every logical parameter of a simple hiking accident. The park records were scoured. Their vehicle, a rented red Pontiac Grand Prix, was conspicuously absent. This was not a hiker who had strayed from the path. This was an outright vanishing, one that immediately suggested human intervention. Carol Sund was 42, a responsible and cautious woman. Julie was 15, and Sylvina 16, full of the exuberant life that teenagers possess. The sheer scale of the operation quickly grew, drawing in the FBI, the National Park Service Rangers, and dozens of local law enforcement officials. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the snow-covered peaks and valleys, while ground teams navigated the dense conifer forests, calling out names that only the wind answered. The emotional toll on the families, particularly on Carol's husband, Jens, and their other daughter, was devastating in public. They pleaded on television, their voices raw with anxiety, projecting the images of the 3 smiling faces into millions of living rooms, hoping that a single eyewitness might step forward. But the vast silence of the Sierra held its grip, refusing to yield a single tangible clue. Days turned into weeks, and the narrative slowly, painfully, shifted from a search and rescue operation to a criminal investigation. The absence of the car was the single, screaming piece of evidence that pointed toward abduction. Someone had taken them. But who, and why, and where had they gone? It was this unsettling mystery, this narrative chasm, that kept the entire nation paralyzed with dread, a dread amplified by the knowledge that somewhere out there, a predator was moving through the woods they thought they knew. This was not the wilderness claiming its own. This was something darker. This was intentional malice, hidden somewhere in the shadow of El Capitan. The initial assumptions of a simple tragedy had been thoroughly discredited, replaced by the crushing realization that 3 lives had been extinguished by a cold, calculating hand. The investigation had reached a frightening plateau, suspended between the hope of finding a survivor and the terrifying prospect of finding something far, far worse. The world was waiting for the smallest piece of evidence, a single thread that could be pulled from the colossal, tangled knot of the Sierra Nevada. The stage was set for a discovery that would not just solve a disappearance, but expose a genuine monster living quietly among them. The knot began to unravel, not in the pristine beauty of Yosemite Valley, but in a distant, desolate location, nearly 100 miles away, miles outside the park's boundaries. The moment arrived on March 18th, almost a full month after the women disappeared. A man driving on a remote logging road near the town of Long Barn, California, noticed something profoundly out of place. The charred, skeletal remains of a vehicle pushed down a steep embankment. It was a crime scene concealed by fire and isolation, the ultimate discard after a brutal act. When law enforcement and forensic teams arrived, they confirmed the horrific certainty. It was the rented red Pontiac Grand Prix. The discovery instantly confirmed the worst fears of the families and the FBI. This was not a matter of getting lost. It was the final, devastating act of an abduction. The initial inspection of the car revealed an almost unbelievable level of violence. The interior completely destroyed by the intense heat of the fire. The vehicle had been doused in a flammable liquid, likely gasoline, and set ablaze, a crude attempt to annihilate the evidence and ensure the contents would be utterly destroyed. It was a calculated action that spoke to a perpetrator who was attempting to clean up a catastrophic mess. Investigators, working with a dreadful, focused intensity, began the painstaking process of sifting through the remains. What they found inside the trunk shattered whatever thin barrier of professional detachment they still possessed. 2 bodies were discovered, fused and burned beyond recognition. The process of identification was long and grueling, relying on dental records. But the grim truth was eventually confirmed. The remains belonged to Carol Sund and Sund-Pelosso. Carol had been strangled, then shot. Sylvina had been sexually assaulted and then shot. The sheer brutality was a shock even to seasoned investigators, transforming the case from a high-profile, missing persons search into an outright serial murder investigation. The shockwaves of the discovery radiated across the nation. The face of the wilderness had been stained with human depravity, and the media descended with a furious, unblinking glare. But the grim tally was incomplete. A crucial, chilling detail hung in the cold Sierra air. Julie Sund, the 15-year-old daughter, was still missing. Her absence in the burned-out car was not a reprieve, but an agonizing new line of inquiry. The discovery of the vehicle and 2 bodies raised immediate questions about the killer's operational method, his geographic knowledge, and his capacity for sheer evil. The killer clearly knew the remote logging roads, had access to a vehicle capable of reaching the site, and possessed a chilling disregard for life. Furthermore, he had attempted to mislead the police by disposing of Carol Sund's wallet far away in Modesto, a move that had initially sent search teams off on a series of frustrating and futile dead ends. This was a monster with patience, with cunning, a man not stumbling through a crime, but deliberately architecting a tragedy. The FBI established a massive command center, the resources of multiple agencies now fully engaged in a manhunt with a horrifying urgency. They now knew the monster was real, but they were no closer to knowing his name. The physical evidence from the charred car was minimal but crucial. Fragments of rope, shell casings, and the forensic signatures of the accelerant used. They hoped the fire had not consumed every piece of the puzzle. The psychological profile began to take shape, organized, forensically aware, and escalating in violence. The hunt for Julie Sund became an act of almost spiritual desperation. Where had the killer taken her in the final moments? Was she still alive? That desperate flicker of hope, however faint, was the only thing preventing total despair, even as the investigators recognized the statistical improbability of finding her alive after such a prolonged period. The second shoe dropped a week later, providing a final, devastating answer to the question of Julie's fate. On March 25th, the FBI received an anonymous, hand-drawn map. It was a crude, unnerving diagram containing a stark, bone-chilling message that could only have been written by the killer himself. The note was simply, "We had fun with this one." The map led the investigators not back to Yosemite, but to a remote overlook near the Lake Don Pedro Reservoir, roughly an hour's drive from where the car had been torched. There, dumped unceremoniously, was the decomposed body of Julie Sund. Her throat had been slit. The message and the method confirmed an unspeakable truth. The three women had been subjected to a sustained period of terror before their final, violent end. The scale of the tragedy was now complete, and the focus of the investigation narrowed with a razor's edge. From a missing persons case, to a double murder, to the relentless pursuit of a serial killer who had turned the state's most beloved national park into his hunting ground. The introduction of the anonymous, macabre map was more than just a clue. It was a brazen, terrifying taunt from the killer. It confirmed a chilling, almost theatrical element to the crimes, demonstrating a desire not just to kill, but to control the narrative, to play a sadistic game with the authorities. The message, "We had fun with this one," was a window into a mind consumed by a perverse, ego-driven compulsion, and it immediately added a new, darker dimension to the killer's profile. This individual was calculating, arrogant, and intimately familiar with the region, navigating the remote highways and logging trails with ease. The FBI's full attention now pivoted to the investigation of a serial predator they quickly dubbed the Yosemite Killer. The pressure on the task force was immense. The family's grief was palpable, the nation's attention was fixed, and the fear that this killer would strike again was a constant, haunting dread. Every person interviewed in the vicinity of the Cedar Lodge was reevaluated. Every maintenance worker, every hotel employee, every local with intimate knowledge of the area became a potential suspect. It was a classic whodunit, set against a backdrop of natural grandeur, with the killer hiding in plain sight. They circulated details of the rental car's last confirmed sightings, attempting to create a timeline of the women's final hours. They knew the abduction had occurred inside the motel room, an act that required an element of surprise, perhaps even a false sense of authority or an intimate knowledge of the premises. This led investigators to concentrate heavily on the employees of the Cedar Lodge, but one name, a maintenance man named Cary Stayner, initially passed under the radar. Stayner was interviewed early on, presenting himself as helpful, cooperative, and unremarkable. He was a local, a seemingly clean-cut man with no criminal record, whose life, on the surface, seemed as mundane as any other resident of the small mountain community. Investigators moved on, distracted by the red herring of Carol's wallet being dropped in Modesto, a deliberate misdirection that had wasted precious early days of the investigation. The anonymous tip, however, the one leading to Julie's body, changed the investigative focus entirely. Forensic linguists and handwriting experts analyzed the note and the crude map, hoping to extract a demographic profile. The search for a physical link between the three crime scenes, the motel, the burned-out car, and the reservoir overlook, began in earnest. Every square inch of the three distinct locations was meticulously processed, hoping for a fiber, a fingerprint, a tire track. The massive search, utilizing helicopters, ground teams, and even underwater units in the reservoir, was the largest in the history of the park. Yet, weeks turned into months, and the trail grew cold, the Sierra once again embracing its vast, silent indifference. Then came the unbearable silence of summer. The park was filling with new tourists, families seeking the same beautiful, ephemeral joy that the Sund-Pelosso party had sought. It was a silence that was shattered in the most brutal fashion imaginable just 4 months later. On July 21st, 1999, Joie Armstrong, a 26-year-old naturalist for the Yosemite Institute, was staying at a cabin in the park employee housing area of Forsta. She was an energetic, popular woman, deeply connected to the wilderness she taught others to love. She vanished that night. The next day, her decapitated body was discovered by a search and rescue team in a creek bed near her cabin. The ferocity and sheer depravity of this fourth murder instantly confirmed the investigators' worst fear. The Yosemite Killer had returned. The MO was different in some ways, a single, local victim, an escalation of violence. But the signature of the crime, the sexual violence, and the complete, chilling domination of the victim echoed the earlier tragedy. The killer was now operating inside the park, targeting a local employee, a chilling sign of increased confidence and brazenness. The pressure on the FBI reached a critical, almost unbearable intensity. The media firestorm roared back to life, demanding answers, demanding an arrest. The Yosemite National Park, a symbol of American freedom and natural beauty, had been transformed into a symbol of terror. The murder of Joie Armstrong provided the crucial break in the case, a horrifying final escalation that forced the killer to momentarily lose his cool, thus revealing the first tangible piece of evidence. This time, the investigators were not distracted. They focused immediately on the area around Joie's cabin in Forsta. Eyewitnesses reported seeing a distinctive blue 1972 International Scout parked near her residence shortly before she disappeared. This was the first solid lead pointing directly to a vehicle. Detectives immediately began tracing the ownership of every similar vehicle in Mariposa County. The trail quickly led back to the one individual they had discounted just 4 months earlier, Cary Stayner, the handyman from the Cedar Lodge. Stayner had been interviewed after the Sund-Pelosso disappearances, but he had been deemed harmless, a sympathetic local whose testimony had been quickly dismissed. But now, the pieces clicked into place with horrifying precision. Stayner drove an International Scout that matched the eyewitness description. The FBI quietly put him under surveillance, noting his movements with a quiet, steely resolve. It didn't take long for the surveillance to pinpoint his location. Stayner had checked into the Laguna del Sol nudist resort in Wilton, California, a place far removed, both geographically and psychologically, from the dense, dark woods of Yosemite. It was at this resort, on July 24, 1999, that 2 FBI special agents, John Bowles and Jeff Rinnick, approached Stayner. The encounter was not an immediate, aggressive arrest. Instead, the agents employed a subtle, non-confrontational strategy, drawing Stayner into a conversation about his life, his family, and his connection to the region. They spoke with him for hours, gradually building a rapport that would prove to be the most critical development in the entire case. Stayner, a man who had clearly carried a tremendous, secret burden of depravity for years, began to talk. The psychological profile of the man was one of deep-seated trauma and repressed violence. He was the older brother of Stephen Stayner, the boy who had been abducted in 1972 and held captive for 7 years, a traumatic event that had been a national news story and the subject of a television miniseries. While the public had focused on Stephen's ordeal, Cary had quietly, festeringly internalized the trauma, feeling overshadowed and invisible. He was a man with a desperate craving for attention and a deep-seated contempt for women. The casual, conversational technique of Agent Rinnick struck a nerve. He offered Stayner a chance to unburden himself, a moment of profound psychological relief from the monstrous secret he harbored. During the lengthy drive to the FBI office in Sacramento, Stayner began to confess. He admitted to the brutal murder of Joie Armstrong, detailing the location of her body and the horrifying method of her death. But the conversation did not stop there. In a stunning, dramatic revelation that provided a long-awaited answer to the families and the nation, Stayner confessed to the abduction and murder of Carol, Julie Sund, and Sund-Pelosso. He described how he had entered their room at the Cedar Lodge under the pretense of fixing a water leak. He confessed to strangling Carol, sexually assaulting the teenagers, and then driving the 3 victims out of the park. The sheer, cold-blooded efficiency of his recall was horrifying. He described stashing the bodies in the trunk of the rental car and setting it on fire, and he admitted to being the author of the chilling anonymous note and map that led to Julie's body. He had not just witnessed the Yosemite horror, he had orchestrated every moment of it. The man they had interviewed and dismissed as a sympathetic local had been the Yosemite killer all along, a maintenance man whose access to the hotel had given him the perfect opportunity to commit his crimes. The seemingly random, geographically dispersed crimes suddenly formed a coherent, terrifying pattern of predatory violence. The details of the confession were so specific, so deeply interwoven with the facts of the case, that they could only have come from the killer himself. The relief for the investigators was immense. Yet it was completely overshadowed by the profound tragedy of the lives lost. The mountains had not claimed these victims. A man had, a man hiding behind a calm demeanor and a maintenance uniform. The question of why was partially answered by Stayner's own dark compulsion, a desire for domination and a need for the sort of public attention he felt had been stolen from him by his brother's tragic fame. The case was solved, but the dark legacy of the Yosemite killer had just begun. The confession of Cary Stayner closed the case files, but it simultaneously ripped open the deep, festering wounds of the victims' families and exposed the psychological labyrinth of a man damaged by a lifetime of private agony. The revelation that the killer was not some phantom monster from the deep woods, but a quiet, familiar employee, the clean-cut handyman at the lodge, added a disturbing layer of betrayal and banality to the horror. It confirmed a foundational truth of true crime. The most terrifying monsters often look exactly like ordinary men. The legal proceedings that followed were meticulously handled by the state and federal authorities. Stayner was tried in federal court for the murder of Joie Armstrong because her death occurred on federal land within the national park boundary. He was also charged in state court for the murders of the Sund-Pelosso party. His defense team attempted to argue insanity, pointing to his troubled childhood, the trauma of his brother's famous kidnapping and escape, and a clear history of obsessive and violent sexual fantasies. Experts testified that Stayner suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder and paraphilia, painting a picture of a man psychologically broken and driven by uncontrollable urges. But the prosecution countered with the undeniable evidence of premeditation and cold, calculated action. Stayner had meticulously planned his attacks. He had lied to gain entrance to the motel room, driven the victims over vast distances, used fire to eliminate evidence, and intentionally dropped Carol's wallet in a far-off town to misdirect the police. Most damningly, he had sent the anonymous, taunting map to the FBI. These are not the acts of a man consumed by an irresistible impulse. They were the actions of a cunning, organized serial killer focused on control. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense. In 2002, Cary Stayner was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and was sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await his execution, a final, concrete confirmation of the justice system's judgment on his crimes. The trials, while necessary for justice, became a painful, prolonged public reckoning for the families. They were forced to hear the gruesome details of their loved ones' final moments, a fresh, agonizing wave of grief washing over the initial shock. Jens Sund, Carol's husband and Julie's father, displayed a quiet, dignified strength, ultimately finding a measure of closure in the conviction. The memory of the victims, Carol, the loving mother, Julie, the vibrant daughter, Sylvina, the hopeful exchange student, and Joie, the passionate naturalist, became forever entwined with the majestic, yet now darkly shadowed, landscape of Yosemite. The case became a chilling national cautionary tale about the perils of the seemingly safe and the nature of evil that lurks in the quiet corners of the world. It fundamentally altered the perception of safety within America's national parks, once thought of as sanctuaries from human depravity. It highlighted the complex vulnerabilities that arise when human beings venture into the vastness of the natural world, only to find that the greatest danger is often not the elements, but the man next to them. The investigation itself, a sprawling multi-agency effort that spanned hundreds of miles, became a textbook example of how a case could be hampered by deliberate misdirection, only to be solved by the patient application of forensic work and, critically, a single compelling piece of nonverbal evidence: the distinctive tire tracks of the International Scout. The Yosemite killer's reign was short, lasting mere months, but its emotional and psychological fallout lingered for years. Even today, the story serves as a stark reminder that beneath the surface of the idyllic, protected wilderness, the darkest aspects of the human condition can, and sometimes do, emerge with terrifying force. The silence of the Sierra, once meditative, now carries a permanent, heavy weight of tragedy, a whisper of the horror that once stalked its trails. The aftermath of the Stayner conviction brought a deceptive quiet back to the Sierra Nevada, but the emotional and institutional changes left an indelible mark. For the National Park Service, NPS, a profound shift occurred in how they approached missing persons and unexplained deaths. The park, previously focused primarily on rescue, safety education, and natural hazards, was forced to confront the reality of predatory crime within its borders. Interagency cooperation became tighter and more formalized. The old assumptions of hikers simply being lost gave way to a policy that immediately considered foul play, especially in cases where a vehicle or key belongings disappeared. The search and rescue protocols were integrated more closely with hardened FBI and local law enforcement criminal investigation techniques. The vastness of the park, once a romantic ideal, was now viewed through the lens of a potential crime scene. A colossal, challenging environment where evidence could be easily lost, contaminated, or deliberately destroyed. This new vigilance was a permanent tax on the simple joy of the park experience, but a necessary one. For the families, the life sentence of grief was ongoing. They attempted to channel their unimaginable loss into positive action, establishing foundations and advocacy groups dedicated to supporting other victims' families and increasing public safety awareness in wilderness areas. The public memory of the Yosemite killer solidified the case's place in the dark pantheon of American true crime, alongside names like the BTK Killer or the Green River Killer, defined by the brazen cruelty of their acts and the sense of violation they inflicted upon safe public spaces. The media's fascination with Cary Stayner's psychological makeup, the overshadowed brother, the maintenance man with a hidden life, continued long after the conviction, seeking a definitive answer to the ultimate question of why a person commits such unspeakable violence. The simple, unnerving truth was that Stayner himself could never fully articulate it, only admitting to a lifetime of violent fantasies he could no longer suppress. His motives were a toxic mix of personal inadequacy, displaced rage, and a craving for the perverse recognition that notoriety provides. The case also raised difficult questions about the nature of family trauma and its potential to metastasize into violence. The story of Stephen Stayner, the kidnapped and rescued boy, was once a narrative of triumph and survival. Now, it was tragically twinned with the dark history of his older brother, Cary, a man who became a killer in the shadow of that very survival. The public and the press were quick to draw a direct line between the two events, suggesting that the trauma of the younger brother's ordeal had somehow fractured the mind of the elder. This narrative, while compelling and dramatically satisfying, risked oversimplifying the complex origins of a serial killer's pathology, but it spoke to the human need to find a single, comprehensible reason for such profound evil. 7 years after the original disappearance, a casual hiker was trekking through a rarely traveled area of the national forest, miles from the famous valley floor, an area of dense, old-growth timber that had survived multiple fires. The hiker, looking for a secluded spot to rest, stumbled upon a massive, hollowed-out giant sequoia log, a tree trunk long dead and fallen, but its interior providing a natural, cavernous space. What was revealed inside was a sight of such shocking, grotesque finality that it defied belief. Within the confines of that natural, sylvan tomb, the hiker discovered a collection of items: a faded, moldering backpack, a small, silver-plated pendant, and a partial, skeletal human remains. The forensic identification was immediate and conclusive. The bones and personal effects belonged to Alex Mercer, a lone tourist who had vanished 7 years prior, a case that had been dismissed as a hiker lost to the elements, swallowed by the infinite complexity of the park's wild terrain. The remains, while partial, were a man's, and the backpack contained an old, rusted metal arrowhead. Not a souvenir, but an ancient Native American artifact Alex had been known to collect. This discovery, years after the main case, served as a coda to the Yosemite horror, but it also raised a terrifying new proposition that shattered the clean resolution of the Stayner conviction. The body, it was determined, had not been placed there by the wilderness, but deliberately stuffed inside the hollow log, concealed with a horrifying purposefulness. The official cause of death was never definitively determined due to the state of the remains, but the positioning, the deliberate concealment in a giant, hollow tree trunk, bore an uncomfortable, chilling signature. It was a method of disposal that was both theatrical and highly unusual, a signature that did not neatly align with the known methods of Cary Stayner, who favored disposal by fire and in trunks of cars. This raised a new, whispered question among investigators and true crime enthusiasts alike. Did the infamous Yosemite killer operate alone, or was he merely the first man caught in a dark tradition of violence? Was there another predator, equally cunning and perhaps even more geographically focused on the vast, silent corners of the park, a monster who had utilized the monumental trees themselves as both a hiding place and a macabre burial monument? The silence of the 7 intervening years had only masked a darker truth, that the wilderness held not just one secret, but many, and that the tree trunks, the granite canyons, and the fast-flowing rivers of Yosemite were still, perhaps, keeping the quiet confidence of a monster who had never been found. The story of the lone tourist found in the hollowed-out sequoia became the permanent, unspoken postscript to the Yosemite horror, a chilling suggestion that the darkness was deeper and the true monster far more elusive. The discovery of Alex Mercer's remains inside the hollowed-out tree trunk, years after the Stayner case had been closed, created an inescapable gravitational pull back toward the unsettling truth of Yosemite's inherent danger. The official narrative had found its villain in Cary Stayner, but the Mercer case suggested that the park itself fostered a unique, deadly environment that could conceal the acts of multiple unknown predators, or perhaps an entirely overlooked dimension to the known killer. Alex Mercer, the subject of this postscript tragedy, had been a geologist, a man in his late 20s who cherished solo expeditions into the most remote sections of the park. He was experienced, meticulous in his planning, and utterly confident in his ability to navigate the rugged terrain. His disappearance 7 years prior had been classified as an accidental death, a fall, or hypothermia, a tragic but natural consequence of challenging the wilderness. The assumption was based on the sheer difficulty of the terrain. No human could survive a serious injury in that isolated sector for long. Yet, the finding refuted this simple conclusion. The manner of disposal was the single, most unnerving detail. The body was not simply resting at the base of the fallen log. It had been inserted into the hollow interior, a space that would require deliberate effort and a certain amount of strength to access and conceal the remains. The image was unforgettable. A man's final resting place, not a grave dug in the earth, but the wooden, silent belly of a giant tree. Investigators, though deeply invested in the Stayner conviction, could not dismiss the possibility of a copycat or a second serial offender operating in the same national park. The modus operandi of the concealment was vastly different from Stayner's desperate attempts to destroy evidence with fire. This felt more ritualistic, more patient, a trophy-keeping rather than a panic disposal. The presence of the rusted metal arrowhead, carefully placed near the remains, became a focal point of forensic analysis. Was it a simple artifact the victim was carrying, or was it a deliberate, symbolic placement by a killer with a fascination for the history of the land? Was this killer seeking a different kind of recognition, one rooted not in media attention, but in the dark mystique of the wilderness itself? The psychological profile began to draw the lines of a new, equally disturbing figure. Someone with deep knowledge of the park's unpatrolled zones, a solitary individual, possibly an experienced woodsman or a longtime resident, who used the environment as a weapon and a cloak. The sheer depth of the park's unmapped, unvisited regions offered an endless opportunity for crimes to go unnoticed for decades. The discovery forced the re-examination of other cold cases in the Yosemite area. Other hikers and tourists who had vanished without a trace, their disappearances attributed to the unforgiving nature of the Sierra. Could some of these simple lost person cases have been, in fact, the victims of an unidentified predator or even a second killer with an entirely different arboreal signature? The emotional weight of the Mercer discovery was a renewed sense of dread and unease for the families of all those who were still missing in the park. For them, the certainty of a natural death was a painful comfort denied. The possibility of a hidden killer meant the terror of their loved ones' last moments might have been entirely human. The initial comfort that the Stayner conviction had brought, the thought that the monster was contained, was now replaced by the terrible, nagging doubt that perhaps the darkness in the heart of the mountains was not a single man, but a systemic, ongoing threat. The very monumentality of the sequoias, once a symbol of timeless permanence, was now stained by the image of a body stuffed inside a hollowed-out trunk. It was a tragic, final piece of evidence that the wilderness, even in its most majestic form, could be corrupted, and that the shadows of Yosemite still held secrets that defied both logic and justice, whispering of a quiet, patient evil that may yet walk free.